Welcome, colleagues. This plenary event is part of Organise 2020, our Trade Union Congress Festival of Organising. As many of you know, the TUC and its affiliated unions are making the working world, a better place for everyone, bringing together more than 6 million working people who make up our 48 member affiliated organisations. Before I kick off and before we kick off this session properly, can I ask all participants to do a couple of things for me? Firstly, please have a look at your Zoom screen and select your preferred language, either English or Portuguese, where you can see the icon at the bottom of your screen. If you do that, then you'll be kept in touch with all of the contributions throughout this plenary event. So please do that now. And can you also note at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. And as we hear from our contributors today, you'll have the opportunity to put questions to our panel. So please do use that icon to raise your questions, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of those as we possibly can this afternoon. You should also have seen a copy of the TUC's Code of Conduct. If not, it will be displayed on your screen pretty much now. Please do remind yourselves of that Code of Conduct. It's extremely important to us that we behave in a manner which is respectful to others, and where we're raising any comments, that we do so in a manner which doesn't seek to intimidate, isn't offensive, isn't aggressive, but actually respects everyone who is here today. So thanks very much for that. So coming back to today's session, the purpose of this session is to raise awareness about the growing far-right threat within our communities and within our workplaces, and to highlight how we as unions are seeking to respond to that threat, both at a national level but also internationally. And in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic, we'll also hear from colleagues about how authoritarian regimes are using the current global crisis to further crack down on rights and to promote harmful anti-migrant and racist narratives. The electoral success of populist and right-wing parties has presented a challenge to our trade union organisations right around the world. Right-wing groups are influencing mainstream political narratives through the assertion of nationalist policies, anti-immigration rhetoric, political and economic agendas that have as their target democracy, human rights, workers' rights, and of course, wider civil liberties. We have to defeat those narratives, colleagues, and we must also take action together to expose and defeat the racial injustice that's being perpetrated in our workplaces and in the economic, social, political, and environmental spheres where this injustice is being perpetrated. Now, the coronavirus crisis has exposed the searing inequalities caused by policies of economic austerity, privatisation, commercialisation, and the casualisation of work. There's growing concern that emergency measures to deal with the pandemic have further exacerbated inequalities, not least in terms of widening health, education, and economic inequality. In many countries, there's concern about how some of the emergency measures enacted are impinging on the human rights and civil liberties of workers, and to what extent those rights are going to be rescinded after the crisis has abated. Emergency powers have been adopted across many countries, leading to the suspension of workers' rights. So this session is an opportunity to hear from trade union leaders around the world about what our unions are doing in response. Now, colleagues, Organise 2020 is more than just a festival to showcase the strengths of trade union organising. It's also an opportunity for us to regroup, to reaffirm, to renew the power of trade unions in securing the change that working people need. The fight against racism and the far right is core to that agenda for change. How can we strengthen our campaigning? What are the practical tools and responses that we need to develop? How can we ensure that when we debate these issues, we also translate our thinking, our ideas into action, an action that has an impact? So let's take the opportunity today to reflect and to learn, but also to commit to deepen the action that we take and to increase the impact of our unions, our members and our activists in the fight against racism and the far right, nationally and internationally. Now, I just want to say that the TUC is also planning an international exchange of strategies which will be revealed in the coming weeks and months. And we also hope that participants today will commit actively to getting involved in the forthcoming TUC's regional networks to develop strategies to combat racist and right-wing narratives. And I also want to make a plug to encourage you all to attend on Saturday the workshop where some more examples of good practice on how together we can challenge these racist and far-right narratives in our workplaces. Those strategies will be launched at that workshop on Saturday. So without any more ado, a big welcome to our panelists and to you, our audience. Just a reminder again, please ensure that you select on the interpreting system your chosen language, either English or Portuguese. And please do use the Q&A function that you'll find in the bottom panel of your Zoom menu. Now, all participants are muted on your entry into this plenary session. Please do remain muted in respect for our panelists and also for everyone else that's here today. But we're not going to ask you to be silent. We want your questions, but we also want you to tweet about this event using the hashtag Organise 2020. And finally, colleagues, can I say that this is a public event and the TUC will be recording this event and may place that recording on YouTube afterwards. So let me start by introducing our panelists. Chidi King is Director of Equalities in the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC. Tefere Gebre is Executive Vice President of AFL-CIO, and in 2013 he became the first immigrant political refugee, black man and local leader elected as a national officer of the AFL-CIO. Carmen Foro is General Secretary of the CUT in Brazil, one of the largest trade union confederations with, wait for it, 7.5 million members. She was a regional leader of the Federation of Agricultural Workers. And Narari Garnik works with the Youth INTUC, that's the Indian National Trade Union Congress in India, Odisha state of India, organising and coordinating activities of youth and promoting those activities in social media. I'm sure that all of our 400 plus participants today will want to thank those panelists for being here today and talking about their experiences. And we're going to hear from each of our speakers first, and then we're going to take questions. So please do ensure that you think about, you listen to, and that you include your questions in the Q&A. Questions, please, colleagues, not speeches, but we will attempt to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can this afternoon. So without any more ado, I'm going to invite Chidi King from ITUC to make her presentation.
Oops. Sorry. Hi, Patrick, and thank you very much for that introduction. I was having trouble controlling my settings for a second there. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to have been invited to speak at this Organise 2020 event of the TUC, and particularly on this subject, which is close to my heart, concerning the rise of the far right and how do we challenge as a trade union movement, what this seemingly relentless rise of right-wing political parties, but also right-wing thought permeating, the mainstream, whether it's our mainstream media, whether it's our mainstream discourse, whether it is indeed the very fabric of our societies and our trade union movement. And the presence or indeed gains made by the far right are of course nothing new for us. It's something that as a trade union and social movement we find ourselves having to confront every now and again. But I think we can certainly say that since the early mid-2010s we saw what came together as almost the perfect storm to lay the path, if you like, for the resurgence of right-wing politics and movements. So we had the global financial collapse in 2008, which was followed very swiftly by the message put out to all of us that in order to build our recovery, we're all in this together, but we all have to tighten our belts. Then ushered in on the back of that, as we know, were austerity measures, which included cuts to our public services, in effect, cuts to our social wage. This was built on the back of this was brought in at the time of a great recession with great loss of jobs, huge insecurity amongst workers and their families. And of course, accompanied, as always, by strong attacks on trade unions and our right to organize, our right to collective bargaining, not only in terms of legislation that was put forward that dampened or removed such rights, but also, of course, in the increased precariousness of work, which meant that labor rights, labor protections, job security were increasingly taken away from workers. So we have this perfect storm into which, of course, step the great savior. And whilst right-wing extremism is not a monolith, let me say, it may take varied forms, different shapes, different shades in different parts of the world. There are elements that are common to every rise, whether it's rise of the right wing, whether it's seized or whether it's portrayed in political power by Modi in India or Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Morrison in Australia, Wilders in the Netherlands, Duterte in Philippines. The list just seems to go on and on. Some of the elements that they all have certainly in common is racism, xenophobia, this strongman figurehead and the attendant misogyny that ushers in, authoritarianism, nationalism, or if you like, anti-internationalism. And of course, this portrayal of this politics as being the savior of the common person, as being, us against the world being the establishment or the elite. The irony, of course, being that very much that the politicians who form the figureheads of these movements very often are indeed the elite embodied. So it's no coincidence that these factors always come together, where we have the rise of popular right-wing extremism within the population and, of course, within our trade union movement. I think it's really incumbent on us to recognize that our movement, our members are very much part of the general population, and very often what we see play out, of course, in the general population is very much played out within our ranks. And we're in the midst of another perfect storm. We're about to see, the worst economic crisis that we will have seen in our different generations that are here. This is following, of course, from a global pandemic, the likes of which we have never seen. And of course, social strife, the like of which we have never seen, characterized, of course, by the Black Lives Matter movement, an idea whose time has come, the explosion around the world, or the recognition around the world of the fact that our economic systems, our socio-political systems are really built on inequality, on racism, on injustice. So the question now is whether that ushers in, from our perspective, a new movement, whether this allows us as working class to instill indeed that working class consciousness, that solidarity, and to use those elements to counter this rise of far-right extremism. Whether we can really engage with our members on that level, engage in real community organizing as well, in coalition building to stem this rise of the far right that, as I said, does seem relentless. Whether the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement really does give us this pivotal moment in time to turn the tide, to really look at creating a global economy that is based on justice, that is based on a fair share for workers in the economy, that is based on environmental justice as well as social justice, that's based on gender, race, and class justice. And I think this is certainly what our trade union movements and our workers in trade unions are trying to do around the world. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the other guests in this Organise 2020 panel. And I'll say again, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of that. Cheers.
Am I next?
You are. Tefere, sorry, I can't restart my video, but hopefully you can hear me. Please proceed.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, and especially thank you for thinking of me and including me on this panel. So I have a little bit of a presentation that I want to do. Then I will go back and try to answer the three essential questions that was asked of us to address on this panel, and that is how the pandemic has affected our countries, our prospective countries, and how our governments are responding, and how the labor movement is also responding in the situation. So let me just start by trying to address those three before actually we roll out the presentation. The virus, which has infected almost 3 million people in the United States and has killed about 136,000 people in the United States. And to put that in perspective, the US is about 5% of the world's population, and we are now about 30% of the world's cases on COVID-19. The same goes for death. We represent about a third of the world's death because of the pandemic. This is in one of the most developed countries in the world that this is happening. So we see not only one pandemic, but we see three pandemics at the same time. And the pandemic that is a disease, the pandemic of unemployment, and a pandemic of racism. We're just seeing clearly right in front of us. Why I say racism, I want to focus on that one today, and I think it's about time for the labor movement globally to not only embrace, not only recognize that racism is not good, not only for people of color, but for all workers, but to play a key role, to play a leading role in combating racism, because unless we do that, I'm afraid that we cannot combat anything else that we try to combat. So here in the United States, Black people are dying, Black workers are dying at 360% the rate of white people are dying. Latinx people, Latin Americans, are dying at 250% that of Black people, white people. So we were told, and scientifically it is right, COVID-19 does not discriminate and does not care what your skin color is. Then it's essential that we have to ask, then why are people of color suffering and dying because of this pandemic more than white people are? And I'll make my case, and that is the result of slavery. That's the result of colonization. That's the result of 400 years of racism that this pandemic is exposing. In addition to that, people of color happen to be in what our government classifies as essential workers. They tend to be bus drivers. They tend to be grocery workers. They tend to be nurses and healthcare workers. They tend to be first responders. And because of that, they are forced not to stay home, but to actually go and work as essential workers at low rate and at low pay. So they are forced practically, either they pay the bills or they get sick themselves and they take this pandemic back to their households. That, brothers and sisters, is essentially why this pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color. I know there has been a lot talked about pre-existing conditions. Those pre-existing conditions also are a result of society's neglect of people of color. We pay taxes at the same rate, but we tend to live in areas that are more polluted. We get to work in jobs that does not provide healthcare. Grocery stores are not accessible to most Black people in this country. They have to drive miles and miles and miles to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. Other than that, they have to go to liquor store and buy high sugar, non-nutrient foods. And that creates the pre-existing conditions. I would go on and on and on, from housing discrimination to transportation discrimination. That is the cause of part of the pandemic that's affecting people of color. So how is our government responding? In general, our government has failed. Our right-wing government, led by Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress, has failed to respond and has exposed America's underlying weaknesses in how we respond. Just think about it. When it comes to war, this is probably the most protected country in the world, the safest country in the world against military attacks. But we're finding ourselves being the least prepared country in the world when it comes to health pandemic. That is something we have to take to heart, and we have to work to address. The fact that we can't even get protective equipment for our members who are forced to go to work is a shame by itself. Instead of addressing these issues, our government has gone overtime to point fingers and to others, blaming Asian Americans and calling it Kung Fu flu, all kinds of names, to deflect from the responsibility that our government should be having. So how our unions have been responding? We have been responding with 5 essentials for working people. We have been laser focused on those 5 essentials for working people, which you can find at our website at AFL-CIO, at aflcio.org. They are: keep frontline workers safe, keep workers employed, and protected earned pensions, pension checks, keep state and local governments functional, and protect our postal services and public schools, keep America healthy and protect and expand health insurance for all workers, keep America competitive, hire people to build our infrastructure. So those are the 5 things that we're focusing on in responding to this pandemic. We have been mobilizing our members. We have mobilized hundreds of thousands of members to take action into the response of the government. And in addition to this pandemic, as you all know, our streets have been engulfed. People demanding justice, especially for Black people. It's not only about the police, it's about systemic racism that has existed in America for over 400 years. And the labor movement has responded in aligning itself with Black Lives Matter. Our building at the AFL-CIO building, which is right in front of the AFL-CIO, we have a 60-foot banner supporting Black Lives Matter decorating our building. We used to be on 16th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. The street that the AFL-CIO resides on has been changed to Black Lives Matter Plaza. But brothers and sisters, those are slogans. We need real solutions and we need real answers. And that is inequality. Inequality caused by racism that the labor movement globally has to commit to fight it. Not to do statement papers, not just to do memos, but to actually make it essentially part of our work. We gotta care about racism as much as we care about our collective bargaining agreements. Other than that, brothers and sisters, I think the next pandemic would actually expose even more to that. So if you just roll the PowerPoints that I wanted to present to you, these are government data. It's not something that I'm making up. That to understand the cruelty of racism in our world. So can somebody put up the PowerPoint for me? We just started a minute ago.
I know, Tefere, that we've been having some technical issues with the presentation behind, as it were, the curtain. We're trying to fix that.
Yeah, but so let me just talk about it from my head. So what do we mean about when we talk about racism in America? I'm not talking about someone not saying the N-word. You shouldn't say the N-word, but that's not what is hurting Black people. The issue is not policing, because the police existing rules that are within us. So in charts I wanted to show you was the wealth gap. The average wealth of Black families in America hovers around about $15,000. The average wealth for white families in America is $157,000. Let me repeat that. $15,000 versus $157,000. We can't change the attitude of the police at every precinct. We can't take away guns from the police. We can't ban police from choking people to death. We should. But my point today, brothers and sisters, as trade unionists, that is not what essentially we need to be fighting for. We have to find a way to close the wealth gap that exists in the United States, and I'm very sure that exists globally. The residual of racism and colonization is still wreaking havoc on the lives of Black people and brown people in our world. So what does the labor movement need to do? We need to be practical. We need to be honest. And we need to hit this head on by not shying away from it. If you want to slow down right-wing governments around the globe, we cannot shy away from the best tool they use to organize, and that's racism and xenophobia. And we have to be as organized as they are in meeting them head on. I know a lot of times we use the cover of, we have to talk about all workers. Yes, we should talk about all workers, but all workers do not have the same starting point. It's like someone asking me to run a 200-yard race and saying, someone is running the same 200 yards with you. You need to finish the race. It's about all of us. But in the lane I run, the truck has holes in it. I have to jump through barrels. I have to jump through shrub when my competitor is running straight on a smooth track. We have to address that if we really want to curb the growth of right-wing governments around the world. We have to be honest and we have to be head-on about it. I know it sounds like divisive. I know it sounds like reverse racism in a way, but it's not. It's not. We gotta fight against tokenism. Some of us have made it to the top of the pyramid of the labor movement. That doesn't mean we're there. We gotta stop saying we got one. We gotta be about all, brothers and sisters. So I think this is a forum that we should talk about this kind of things. And I'm not gonna apologize if I've been very aggressive on this, but issue number one, number two, number three, if it was up to me for the global labor movement, is combating racism, combating otherness, combating anti-migrant phobia. Unless we do that, none of us are gonna rise up. None of us are gonna realize the power that our movements have. Thank you so much. You're muted.
Thank you very much for that, Tefere. I thought I'd managed to conquer the mute button, but clearly not. That was a very powerful address, and I know, looking at the chat, that was very well received. And Chidi, exactly the same. I apologize that I wasn't able to thank you directly for your presentation, because that has been well received. I'm going to move on to Carmen Foro from CUT Brazil, and invite Carmen to take the floor.
Então, bom dia a todos e todas. Gostaria de agradecer a oportunidade, parabenizar os organizadores por este importante debate, por esta importante agenda. Eu sou Carmen Foro, sou secretária-geral da CUT Brasil. E quero falar sobre o projeto da extrema-direita, o projeto da extrema-direita é um projeto de extermínio da classe trabalhadora no Brasil. Nós já estamos, desde o ano de 2016, vivendo uma situação de golpe e de retirada do direito dos trabalhadores e das trabalhadoras. A classe trabalhadora, nesse momento, sofre com o desemprego, com a informalidade, e estes dados vêm piorando nos últimos 3 meses da pandemia. Desde 2016, com o golpe, nós sofremos muito com as reformas trabalhistas, com reforma previdenciária, com medidas do governo que retiraram direitos e enfraqueceram o movimento sindical. Isto é possível constatar a partir das ações que a própria OIT teve em relação ao Brasil nos anos de 2018 e 2019. O Brasil entrou na lista curta de casos da OIT, denunciando a situação de retirada dos direitos dos trabalhadores neste período. E, infelizmente, nós estamos entre os 10 piores países, neste momento, para a classe trabalhadora no Brasil. Eu aqui digo que o Brasil é um violador de direitos, um violador dos direitos humanos. E isso se transformou em uma política de governo nacional. Posso aqui recuperar como os direitos humanos do presidente Lula, que foi retirado da possibilidade de ser candidato, sendo preso sem nenhum crime. Posso aqui também falar do assassinato de Marielle, que até agora nós não temos a prisão de quem assassinou Marielle. O uso das fake news para a eleição do presidente Bolsonaro. As invasões das terras indígenas e o assassinato de líderes indígenas e líderes trabalhadores rurais. O ódio verbalizado pelo presidente da República aos trabalhadores e às trabalhadoras. E quando se trata de trabalhador negro, a situação é ainda mais grave. Nós somos uma população com 55% de negros e negras no Brasil. E herdamos uma visão escravagista por mais de 380 anos. Temos um curto tempo de abolição da escravidão, muito curto tempo. Bom, e esta é a população mais vulnerável que nós temos hoje. Estão morando nas periferias, com empregos e salários menores do que toda o restante da classe trabalhadora, que alimenta-se muito mal, portanto, estão muito vulneráveis à pandemia, ao Covid-19. Tem moradias muito precárias, água e esgoto com muita dificuldade de acesso, e isso nos leva a ter hoje no Brasil, para aqueles que se declaram pardos e negros, 76% dos mortos no Brasil. E, infelizmente, no Brasil, a pandemia agora sai um pouco dos centros urbanos e vão para as áreas rurais, para os interiores do Brasil, como, por exemplo, para a Amazônia, para as áreas rurais. E, ao ir para essas áreas, nós temos as comunidades indígenas hoje, com 120 povos sendo atingidos, quase 500 mortos, e mais de 12 mil indígenas afetados pela pandemia, pelo coronavírus. Nós temos também a população quilombola, que vive também uma situação muito trágica. E nós temos o governo se posicionando e vetando todas as tentativas de leis que garantem melhoria das condições para essas populações enfrentarem a pandemia. Nós também já vivemos há bastante tempo um clima de violência contra as populações negras. É noticiário nas favelas a morte de jovens negros em quantidades graves, né? E temos um governo que tem tentado destruir educação, meio ambiente e um ataque terrível à Amazônia brasileira. Um Congresso Nacional que é capaz de aprovar e seguir uma linha de 4 anos atrás de ajuste fiscal e redução dos direitos dos trabalhadores. Então, a pandemia deixa claro o projeto genocida do governo Bolsonaro, que nega permanentemente a doença como um problema grave no auge que nós estamos vivendo. Nega e propagandeia remédios que está comprovado por todo mundo que não tem nenhuma eficácia. Nós temos nos movido frente a esta situação de forma a entender que não haverá uma saída desta crise, deste conjunto de crises que nós estamos vivendo nesse momento, que é uma crise sanitária, uma crise econômica e social, e no Brasil, em particular, uma crise política sem precedente, assim como uma crise ambiental. É provável que nos próximos dias nós possamos ver novamente a Amazônia em chamas e nenhuma providência tomada por parte do governo federal. Então, nossa movimentação para enfrentar esta situação tem sido uma movimentação no sentido de articulação coletiva das centrais sindicais, dos movimentos sociais. A CUT tem estado junto com todos esses movimentos. E, ao longo deste período, nós produzimos uma articulação com os movimentos sociais e produzimos uma agenda básica para enfrentar este momento, que diz respeito a uma renda emergencial, e nós queremos atravessar esse debate para garantir uma renda universal básica. Nós temos produzido campanhas de solidariedade, porque tem muita gente passando fome no nosso país. Nós temos produzido campanha para o impeachment deste presidente. Nós temos apresentado proposição que vão no sentido de garantia de moradia digna, de saneamento básico e garantia de alimento para a população. Nós temos certeza que o pós-pandemia será um momento de muita pobreza e de uma economia destruída. Mas nós precisamos continuar fazendo um processo de mobilização permanente e de articulação permanente com toda a classe trabalhadora na sua diversidade, que é bastante ampla. Por exemplo, a CUT tem filiada a ela trabalhadores que não recebem salário, que vivem autonomamente, como os trabalhadores rurais, que produzem 70% do alimento para a mesa dos brasileiros. Portanto, nós temos feito pressão ao governo no sentido de garantir recurso para manter a produção de alimentos para os brasileiros e brasileiras. Encerro aqui minha fala, dentro do tempo, agradecendo muito aos organizadores em poder compartilhar o momento que vivemos nesse Brasil, no nosso país é ir entendendo que nossas alianças com os movimentos sociais para fazer campanhas, para pressionar o governo, neste momento, é a principal saída para a crise. E acumular, formular um novo ciclo a partir dos trabalhadores, um novo ciclo de proposição para construirmos verdadeiramente uma agenda de lutas, uma agenda de proposição para a classe trabalhadora brasileira. Muito obrigada pela oportunidade, novamente, de compartilhar o nosso sofrimento. Gratidão.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you so much for that contribution. And I've seen that there have been quite a number of comments on that, about how informative your contribution has been, because part of the narrative agenda of the far right and those in power who seek to silence is to deny the opportunity for us to be informed. So it's so important that we hear from you today about the experiences of our sisters and brothers in Brazil. That was so informative and reminds us about the importance of alliance building as well. And I'm sure that we're going to get many more comments on that. Before I bring in our final contributor, I just want to urge participants to use the Q&A function that we have. We've had a few questions coming already, but even more, I'm sure that the panel will be very pleased to respond to. So please keep your questions coming in using the Q&A function. But now I'm going to turn to Narahari from ITUC in India to address us this afternoon. Narahari, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, and to all the organizers for choosing me. So, good evening to one and all from India. This is Narahari Garnaik, working as the executive member of the National Youth Indian National Trade Union Congress. First of all, my sincere gratitude to the Honorable Chair of the meeting, to the organizing committee, to the respected speakers, and to the audience. To start with, far right has been an ideology of the political parties who use the concept of discriminations and differentiation on the basis of religion, culture, tradition, race, or nations. In India, Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP has used the far right ideology and racism to differentiate peoples of India on the basis of religion, caste, tradition, and culture. This has truly killed the true spirit of democracy in the country, where it is believed that India is the biggest democratic country in the entire world. Secondly, due to the huge population of India, the far-right ideology-based political organizations, workers from different categories like schools and colleges, medium and large-scale industries, paramedical staffs, and private companies have never got equality and justice in their workplace. To give an example, as per the law, under the Government of India, it is clearly defined that equal pay for equal work. But it is surprising to acknowledge that many of the factories do not follow the law. In the same factory where 100 employees or workers will be working, and all have the same qualifications, same skills, and will be assigned with the same work and with same designations. But surprisingly, 80 workers are paid less salary, and the rest 20 workers are paid with more or high paid salary. But I am proudly say that I can. My Trade Union Congress of India has always fought for the rights of the workers, and we take up the case in the court of law to give justice. There is an uncountable success stories, but still we have to go a long way. Today, the workers of India are mostly the victim of racism, and there has been a continuous fight and frequent strikes against the government to give justice to the rights of the workers working in various fields. There has been a panic and terror in India as well as in the entire world for the COVID-19 coronavirus. My pain and grief for the deceased, and my prayers for the affected. And my salute to all the frontline coronavirus warriors, mostly the doctors, paramedical staffs, and the police officials. But far-right ideology-based government in India has completely failed to protect the rights of the workers working in various factories and companies of India. Many workers have lost their jobs. Many have not got their salary since 4 to 5 months, and many are getting a reduced salary. The daily wage workers are not getting works, and their survival has been a question mark now. The government in India is only busy in doing shutdowns and lockdowns, but has failed to bring a policy or strategy for the workers who are believed to be the pillars of the country. Our Indian National Trade Union Congress has undertaken a national-wide strike on July 3rd, 2020 against the BJP government for its failure to bring a policy or strategy for the survival of the migrant workers and for the protection of the rights of the workers at their workplace. During the crisis of COVID-19, my Trade Union Congress undertook many welfare activities by the supply of food materials for the survival of the livelihood of the daily wage workers and the migrant workers. Due to the interference and action of the Trade Union Congress, many women workers got back their jobs and are paid with full salaries, who are taken out by the factories during this coronavirus crisis. Last but not the least, in my view, if we can open a professional group internationally by Trade Union Congress by using a digital platform like WhatsApp or something else, then it would boost up the spirit of togetherness, and we could strongly bring a fight against the far right and challenging racism internationally. With this, I'm Narahari Pragarnaik signing off. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Narahari, for that presentation and for really signposting to us just how pervasive, all pervasive, the issues of racism, but also of far-right ideology, the impact of not only austerity and privatization, commercialization, undermining the rights of workers everywhere. And we really shouldn't lose sight of that. And I've seen that there have been a number of questions in our Q&A which do highlight the connections, the interconnectedness, if you like, of the experiences of workers in the United States, in Brazil, in India, and of course in the UK. And it's vitally important that we consider, as trade unionists and as a wider social movement, how we can make those connections together across the globe in pushing back on racism and on far-right ideology. And it may be an opportune time really to invite the panel just to reflect a little on how we can build some of those coalitions, what that really does need to look like, how we share not only those experiences, but also how we support each other in the struggles that we are experiencing and in our fight against racism, which all panelists have talked about this afternoon, how we can work together in that struggle against racism and far-right ideology in our communities and in our workplaces. So I'd be very interested to hear from the panel about that, but I'm very interested to hear from participants with more questions, hopefully in our Q&A, that you would like to see put to the panel. But I wonder if there are any immediate reflections from the panel on the question of how can we support each other in the United States, in Brazil, in India, and of course in the UK, where we're not immune from the very issues that you have highlighted. How can we support each other better? Any thoughts on that? I wonder if I can, I'll turn to Chidi in the first instance. What are your thoughts about how we support each other?
Thank you. I think maybe the first thing that comes to mind is, again, the fact that, as I think somebody posted in the chat, that just as, far right and right wing parties, movements, governments coordinate across borders, as trade unions, it's really vital for us to be able to do so. And I've noted that quite a few people have already posted in the chat, how do we help support what's happening with the trade union movement in Brazil? It's really vital that we don't stay silent when we see these things happening elsewhere, because what's happening elsewhere will, as we are seeing right now, in fact, will soon be happening at home, wherever home happens to be. So that's one thing. I think the exchanges that we can do between unions across borders is really vital, because we really do need to build the strength, the capacity of our trade union reps to understand what underlies these structural inequalities, structural injustices that we see, whether it's along lines of gender, race, ethnicity, migration, and to be able to have the conversations with our members and be able to organize members around those conversations. Because if we're not doing that, then we've lost the battle. There's no way that we get to change that status quo.
Thank you very much for that, Chidi. I'm going to turn to Carmen. Your thoughts on how we support each other in that fight against racism across international borders, that fight against racism, that fight against far-right narratives. How can we as trade unionists support the CUT in Brazil from where we are sitting in the UK? We've seen a lot of commentary actually following your intervention which indicates that there's a very strong appetite to support our sisters and brothers in Brazil. How can we do that and do that in a way which is meaningful and that has an impact?
Eu entendo que neste momento de pandemia, onde todos estamos muito envolvidos na defesa das pessoas, das condições básicas, e não é uma situação só do Brasil, mas, infelizmente, nós estamos entre os 10 países com maior dificuldade e no pico da pandemia, e com uma postura do governo que, se depender deles, nós já estamos há 30 dias com mortes diárias de 1.000, 1.300 pessoas por dia. Nenhum outro país está vivendo isso. Tiveram curtos espaços de tempo com quantidades muito grandes de mortes diariamente. Nós chegamos a 30 dias. Então, eu entendo que a primeira ação que nós deveríamos fazer de solidariedade entre nós é nos ajudar no processo de denúncia da situação que encontra-se o Brasil. Aqui não houve tempo de descrever tanta atrocidade que nós estamos vivendo. Nós estamos vivendo um problema gravíssimo na área da educação. Se o governo não votar urgentemente um projeto que tramita, nós vamos ter mais de 70% das crianças do ensino básico sem condições de irem à escola, que é a aprovação do Fundeb. Nós temos problemas gravíssimos ambientais. Eu sou da região da Amazônia e, por nada, eles pararam os processos de extração mineral, de invasão das terras dos trabalhadores rurais e das grandes obras. Continuam em pleno processo, como se não houvesse pandemia. Nós também estamos vivenciando, do ponto de vista do racismo, violência, muita violência. Ainda ontem a CUT fez um importante seminário sobre democracia e segurança, porque estamos já sentindo a violência da polícia, a violência do Estado sobre as lideranças que atuam frente às lutas. Então, estamos investindo bastante em formação, em aliança com os movimentos que atuam em diversas áreas, com as igrejas, com os movimentos jurídicos, com grandes personalidades, no sentido de uma forte campanha para o impeachment do presidente Bolsonaro e o seu vice Mourão. Nosso desejo seria ganhar força na sociedade com uma campanha. Portanto, a comunicação para nós é muito importante. Nós vivemos num país que, agora, impedidos de ir à rua, por conta do auge da pandemia, nós temos tentado trabalhar muito por este instrumento. Mas este instrumento não é democrático, porque no Brasil, as populações que estão nas periferias, que estão nos interiores, elas têm dificuldade de acesso à internet. Portanto, comunicação se constitui num instrumento fundamental para nós nesse momento, para fazer a disputa com a extrema-direita, para fazer a disputa de projeto. Eu, pessoalmente, na minha região, estamos fazendo uma movimentação de capacitar as lideranças para o uso desses instrumentos, para poder fazer denúncia, para poder fazer mobilização no próximo período. Então, eu não saberia dizer uma questão, eu diria que essa questão é muito grave. E a população negra, os trabalhadores negros, vivem em situação muito difícil. Nesse momento, a violência contra as mulheres aumentou em 41% só no estado de São Paulo, o feminicídio e a violência, né? Aumentou profundamente. Nós, mulheres, estamos com uma sobrecarga gigante. O trabalho de home office, a redução da renda das famílias administrado pelas mulheres, o trabalho doméstico que se sobrecai sobre a vida das mulheres, o adoecimento psicológico. E quando nós tratamos das precárias condições de trabalho, as mulheres negras estão com uma vulnerabilidade muito agravada nesse momento. Então, nós estamos vivendo um momento de tragédia no Brasil, de muita tragédia, né? Não só pela pandemia, mas pela situação econômica, mas pela situação social, pela situação da violência política e as questões do meio ambiente, que fazem parte dos horrores desse governo, que pretende editar medidas constantemente para expropriar cada vez mais as áreas que ainda têm reservas de água, reservas de floresta, reservas de terra para produção, os bens comuns da nossa sociedade brasileira. Então, queria colocar essas questões e dizer que nós precisamos de ajuda. Nós sempre estivemos e podemos contar com a parceria de várias organizações internacionais. Chegamos a ter uma janela de 13 anos que pautou, construiu políticas importantes para o enfrentamento ao racismo, que no nosso país virou uma situação de normalidade, como o governo agora tende a transformar a tragédia, a pandemia, o coronavírus e as mortes em uma situação de normalidade. É tudo normal. Atencionamento para voltar ao trabalho, e como disse o companheiro da AFL-CIO, os negros estão no fronte dos trabalhos essenciais, nos trabalhos mais precários, como a área de limpeza. As mulheres estão no fronte da pandemia. A área de saúde é uma área que essencialmente é realizada, na sua grande maioria, por mulheres. As mulheres trouxeram a educação dos filhos para dentro de suas casas, além do trabalho e além do trabalho doméstico. Então, é uma situação absurda que vive a sociedade brasileira, mas tenho dito que esta situação ela tem cor, tem classe, e tem CPF, e tem gênero, onde tudo isso está de forma muito mais agravada. Infelizmente, no Brasil, o Covid-19 chegou de avião pela classe média, pela elite, né, vindo de outros países, mas depois que se instalou, ela desceu para as periferias e para os lugares mais pobres, onde faltam instrumentos de saúde, onde faltam alimentação, moradia digna, saneamento básico, e onde já vivem as populações negras em condições precárias e de adoecimento permanente.
Thank you very much for that, Carmen. And I know that that's prompted quite a number, your response has prompted quite a number of comments again in the chat bar. I just want to ask, Priya, just hearing there from Carmen about violence against women and the experiences in Brazil, that very dramatic increase in the levels of violence against women. There have been questions asked in the chat, in the Q&A, about how we organise across international borders. How do we organise women workers and also young workers? An important priority for our trade union movement here in the UK. How can we build that solidarity from the perspective of the trade union movement in India? What does that look like for you? What would be your ask of the movement here in the UK in building that solidarity for women workers and for young workers?
The first challenge is there is no organized registered unions for women workers in informal sectors because they are not allowed to be formed as they always live in a threat to lose their jobs if they form any trade unions. So there is lack of awareness and support from the government for organizing women workers in informal sectors in India. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Another question, which is again in this realm of solidarity and how we build solidarity again across international borders. And this one for Tefere, there have been a number of contributions in the Q&A in the context of, I guess, your remarks on the Black Lives Matter movement and in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And of course, our trade union colleagues in the United States are very close to that, but we're all very close to that. How do we educate for racial justice? What would be for you the priorities for how we begin to build and ensure we have a strong and lasting movement for racial justice in the United States and in the UK in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, but he's not the only one, as we all know. How can we build a strong coalition which leaves a lasting legacy through the education of children and young people, but also ensures that our trade unions across international borders do respond, do continue to stand together against the injustices which you described?
So, Patrick, I'm gonna key on one word you used, lasting. And, you know, of course, we're encouraged by what's happening on the streets. We're encouraged not just by the volume of people who are protesting on the street against injustice and against police brutality, but the quick results that are coming out of these protests. For example, in about 50 jurisdictions in the United States, without even the federal government taking action, chokeholds have been banned. That's a progress. A lot of cities and a lot of municipalities are examining their budgets in how to reallocate police budget. This didn't come from any kind of institution. This is the power of the streets that happens. So going back to the word lasting, I'm worried what would happen when the streets empty out. I'm worried when we go back to regularly scheduled program for all of us. So then I would like to bring it back to us, to the realm that we can control, and that's the trade union. That's a trade union movement. What can we do to make sure that this flame doesn't burn out? And the only answer that we can come up with, at least at AFL-CIO, that's what we're gearing up to do, is we want to continue, not with a set period of time, but continuously to have conversations in every community in this country about racism. Because it would be a mistake for anyone to think racism is about Donald Trump. Racism is about the police. Racism is about our family members. Racism is about our neighbors. And we have to win hearts and minds. And that starts by humanizing Black people as human beings to start out with. And in order for that to happen, we have to have that hard conversation, starting from our own membership and to our community, to our elected leaders, to actually accept the fact that racism exists and come up with not band-aids, but actual solutions in how we move forward. And I think no one is geared up. No one is geared up. No government, no institution is geared up and set up as the labor movement to actually facilitate this conversation, because our members as Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and whites, and mixed race work in the same manufacturing plants, work in the same places, If we don't have the aptitude to start the conversations there, then we're letting a golden opportunity go by. So what does that mean in reality? I'm going to be harsh on us. What does that mean? It doesn't mean a press release. It doesn't mean a statement of support. It means that our work has to show that we care about this. And in order for our work to show that, our budget has to reflect that. Our budget has to reflect that. There isn't any document of statement as our budget is. And I will be convinced and believe the labor movement actually really cares about this when I see our budgets reflecting that.
Thank you for that, Tefere, and you've been very clear in the importance of the challenge that we must confront as trade unionists if we are serious as unions about defeating racism and far-right ideology. Then we've got to be serious in terms of our response to that. And you also spoke about the importance of having a hard conversation within our movement and within our own organizations. And in the Q&A, some colleagues have raised this question: how do we bring all of our members, how do we bring all of our activists along with us? Clearly in this conversation that we're having this afternoon, it's clear that from the chat and from the questions that we are all supportive of the need for action which delivers an impact in the fight against racism, injustice and far-right ideology. But how do we bring all of our members and all of our activists with us? I don't know, Chidi, do you have any thoughts on that challenge?
I think my thoughts would very much echo some of the things that Tefere and Carmen and Priya have said in their interventions as well. I absolutely agree that change isn't going to happen on its own, and one thing that we can't afford to be is silent. So we have to confront these issues head on, not just externally, because they're not just external to our movement. We have to confront them head on within our movement, and part of that, as I mentioned earlier, is equipping our trade union representatives, whoever and wherever they happen to be, whether they're leaders, whether they're grassroots activists, whether they're shop stewards, to be able to understand the factors behind these injustices that we're talking about, to understand the fact that, in fact, the way that our economies, both national and global, operate is systemically designed to oppress, to get the most exploitation possible out of workers, and that it does those along these lines of race, of class, of gender. And then to be able to have those discussions with our membership, and to have the difficult discussions as well with our membership. So it's a political education, but also the challenging conversations that we have to have with our membership to root out attitudes, assumptions, things that we have perhaps absorbed and go along with, because we know, I mean, history tells us that very often accompanied by the rise of populist movements is a corresponding rise, if you like, within our membership as trade unions, and denying that is not going to help us at all. And the other thing I would say is that we can draw hope from, the past. Because in the past, when we have come together, when we have had political education as as something we didn't even think about. It was just part and parcel of what we did as trade unions. When we have had, injustices thrown in our face and have been able to come, together, not just as a trade union movement, but along with other social movements. I think that coalition building also is important and has a place, going into our communities, organizing, building with other like-minded movements is important. And when we've done that, we've been able to propel change. And I think in answer perhaps a little bit to what Tefere was saying, is the question then, is it lasting change? And it can be lasting as long as we don't take our foot off the pedal. I think we tend to enter this zone of complacency once we have achieved a certain degree of change. And then we're surprised when, you know, we're confronted with the same old again. So keeping our foot on that pedal, propelling that change, embedding it, making it lasting is also down to us.
Thank you for that, Chidi, and that real reminder about, you know, we must never be complacent. It's one of the things about trade unions that we have to learn, and we have to remind ourselves time and time again, never be complacent, because those who are against our interests and the interests of our members are watching and they are waiting. But just to pick up on your point, Chidi, and Tefere also mentioned it, and I want to bring in other panelists on this, about the political conversations that need to take place within our unions, the training, the dialogue, how we can ensure that we both have an inclusive and respectful dialogue, but also a challenging dialogue. Because as you've both said, quite rightly, it's vitally important that our movement is no place for those who, you know, will seek to pursue racism and far-right ideology and views. I just wonder, Priya, from the point of view of colleagues in India, what is that political dialogue, that engagement, that training to ensure that all of our members, all of our activists are not only on message, but on board with the need for action in this area? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, the situation of the women workers in informal sectors should be brought into the knowledge of the trade union leaders in Britain. In my views, if we can bring an international fight to aware and support women workers in informal sectors, then it would truly boost up the spirit for forming trade union. Groups from women workers in informal sectors. And if any injustice is done by employees, action and protest can be raised globally to give justice to the women workers, mostly in the informal sectors. Thank you.
I mean, thanks for that, Priya, because one of the important points that you raised, and I know it was raised, and I'm going to bring Carmen in now as well, it was raised in Carmen's address earlier on the rise of precarious employment, that the right to work, the right to decent work, the right to, you know, to know that you have access to employment and to a stable income is being denied to many workers. And Priya just referred there to the vital importance, the critical importance of organising in the informal sectors, in the sectors where casualisation of work is perhaps most acute. And quite often that is where, for example, black workers will be disproportionately found. Be interested in your thoughts on that, Carmen, but also just to hear again from colleagues in Brazil about how do we ensure that all of our activists, all of our trade union representatives are engaged in this fight against racism and the far right?
Bom, a extrema-direita é bastante sedutora, né? Em todos os lugares. E não diferente aqui no Brasil, pôde contar com o voto de muitos trabalhadores, inclusive trabalhadores da base sindical. É como se não vissem outras alternativas, recusam o que já tinham e depois veem o quanto foi errônea a sua presença ou seu voto numa proposta que era contra os próprios trabalhadores. Então, nós vivemos isso aqui no Brasil com a extrema-direita, né? Uma enganação às pessoas com o seu populismo. Então, o quadro, nós estamos no Brasil com um quadro de 48% de informalidade, piorado agora nesse último período. E, obviamente, estamos, nós, negros e negras, nesses lugares de menores condições de trabalho, nesses lugares de maior precarização. E aí você tem a escala, né? O homem branco, a mulher branca, o homem negro e a mulher negra está em último lugar, né? Mas eu, refletindo com vocês aqui, fiquei pensando nesta ideia aí de nós podermos enfrentarmos as nossas próprias dificuldades. Com relação ao racismo, eu acho que nós precisamos, de fato, enfrentar esse debate dentro das nossas organizações. Ela ainda é algo à parte de um projeto de desenvolvimento, a um modelo econômico, do discurso das nossas organizações. Infelizmente, a maioria dos negros e negras ficam levantando a mão e reivindicando um lugar ao sol. Todos os dias, eu sempre digo, todos os dias eu tenho que dizer, eu existo, eu estou aqui, não ignore a minha existência e a minha presença, inclusive na minha organização. Isto é real, né? Isto é num lugar onde o sindicato atua, onde temos um grau de consciência. Imaginem o lugar de uma mulher negra como eu, que venho da zona rural, que venho da Amazônia, que nasci à beira de um rio, que não tive as oportunidades que muitos tiveram, como sou vista no lugar de secretária-geral da CUT Brasil. Parece ser muito pouca coisa, mas não é. E é aquilo que o companheiro relatou aqui, não é por mim, porque eu sei a dor do significado disso, mas é por todos nós. Portanto, eu acho que nós temos desafios internos e externos. O próximo período de formulação sindical, nacional e internacional, no que diz respeito a modelos econômicos, no que diz respeito a modelos de produção, e no que diz respeito a projetos de desenvolvimento, eu imagino que nós temos que saber qual é o lugar da população negra. E eu estou me referindo ao Brasil, mas não só ao Brasil. Qual o lugar da população negra que está na base da produção de riqueza? O meu país, nós somos 55% da população negra. No meu país, nós somos a base da geração de riqueza e nós somos os esquecidos da economia. Nós somos os esquecidos da faculdade. Nós somos os esquecidos da política pública e dos serviços públicos. Imagino que esta comparação que eu faço serve para todo esse debate que nós estamos fazendo aqui. Qual é o lugar da população negra no futuro das economias? Qual vai ser o lugar desta formulação sindical global? Qual vai ser o lugar das políticas públicas para aproximar este fosso de desigualdade existente entre negros e o conjunto da população? Esta é uma pergunta que nós temos que fazer, porque nós estamos fazendo cartas, formulações, e a gente não pode tratar esse tema como um tema da moda e do momento. Ele é estrutural. No Brasil, nós somos 52% da população feminina. Qual é o lugar das mulheres na economia? Nós não somos minoria. Nós não somos minoria. Nem negros, nem mulheres no Brasil são minoria. Nós somos maioria. E há sempre governos que governam para as minorias, né? Para as elites, obviamente, a gente sabe disso, e não governa para a maioria. Nós tivemos agora a oportunidade de ter uma pessoa que assumiu um lugar importante para cuidar do tema do racismo, um negro que não se considera negro, um negro que rechaça os negros, que chama de vagabundo, que ainda bem que por pressão ele saiu, não reconhece o movimento negro, não reconhece as demandas negras, não reconhece que nós temos um país onde os seus formuladores de política, os governos, os formuladores de política, são oriundos de um histórico processo de escravagismo, de um histórico processo de colonialismo. E então eu acho que a educação ela é muito importante. É muito importante, sem ela a gente não pode caminhar, mas não podemos debitar todas as responsabilidades de enfrentamento do racismo à educação. A educação também como, mas não só a educação. Porque é muito fácil se livrar das questões dizendo é uma questão de educação. Não é uma questão apenas de educação. É também uma questão de educação. É uma questão estrutural, econômica, social, de modelo de desenvolvimento, que eu acho que este é o grande desafio sindical para o próximo período. As mudanças têm que acontecerem prioritariamente no lugar onde nós acreditamos ser o lugar da transformação, que é o sindicato. E nós temos que enfrentar essas conversas difíceis, companheira Chidi. Nós temos que enfrentar essas conversas dentro da nossa própria organização. Só um negro e uma negra dentro do sindicato sabe exatamente o significado do que eu estou falando, do que nós estamos falando. Então, eu não acho que nós temos que lutar, nós apenas não somos contra o racismo. Eu acho que é muito pouco a gente dizer que nós somos contrários ao racismo. Nós temos que ser antirracistas. Nós temos que ser cotidianamente antirracistas. Nós temos que ser cotidianamente, nós mulheres, feministas. Nós temos que fazer as lutas e nós temos que ver isso na ação do nosso sindicato como parte de um projeto. Queria colocar isso e novamente agradecer, não sei se ainda tenho oportunidade de falar novamente. Então, a missão é ser antirracista, é ser anticapitalista, é ser anti-homofóbico, como possibilidades reais do futuro.
Thank you for that, Carmen, because I'm absolutely sure that strikes a chord with so many involved in this session. Looking at the chat, there have been a number of similar contributions, and I do want to ask the panel, picking up on again some of the questions in the Q&A. To follow on from Carmen's intervention there, reminding us about the vital importance of developing and shaping an agenda for the future of our society, of our politics, and equally importantly of our economy. How we do that in the context of governments that appear to be pursuing other interests. How do we as unions push back against governments right here, right now, who may be pursuing policies in a post, if you will, post-COVID-19 coronavirus crisis? They're pursuing policies, economic policies, social policies, political policies and projects that could exacerbate inequality, poverty, racism, and other forms of inequality and injustice that actually Carmen was just referring to. A number of our participants are very concerned about how we can seize this moment to reshape a future agenda for our politics, for our society, for our economy, which is one which is founded upon justice. How do we do that? Tefere, your thoughts on that?
That's a lot. Look, it's not easy to look like me and most of us on this panel, to speak with an accent and be in a room full of other leaders who don't look like you. And that's, I want to thank and appreciate all of you who are on this field, who are taking the mantra of fighting with workers, as uncomfortable as it is, as hard as it is, you know, to be at the table. So my thing is, like, our challenge, I think, is how do we utilize that seat we have at the table right now? I'm just really talking about just within the within the labor movement. How annoying do we have to be to actually get people to be annoyed enough to actually agree to change? Right? I know this is going to cause a lot of heartaches with people. I'm not calling anybody racist. I don't think the problem we have is with racists at the largest scale. I think the problem we have is to get people to understand the weight of racism on the entire worker movement. On the entire worker movement. How do we get the rest of our colleagues actually to really realize that? That, you know, I also saw the chat, there's a lot of chatter about the police and how do we deal with the police. In its entire history, the police are charged to police what the ruling society creates and to protect the wealth of the wealthy. That's what they do. That's really what they do. I'm not in any way saying that we don't need police reform. I'm gonna die fighting for police reform. But the thing is, I'm gonna tell you a story and stop at that. Why I don't think it's, I'm married to a white woman. And back in 2012, we decided to sell our house and we wanted to move to another neighborhood and we're looking for a house. And all of a sudden, slowly driving around the neighborhood, looking at houses, I got pulled over by police. The officer didn't come to me. He went to my wife and told her, "Are you okay?" She said, "What do you mean, are you okay?" He said, like, "Are you under duress to tell me you're okay, to tell me if you're not okay?" Then finally he came to me and I said, "Why did you pull me over?" He said, "A neighbor called to tell him there was a white woman under stress being driven by me." Brothers and sisters, that is not a police problem. That, I don't know if that woman is a racist or not, or believes for her to be, herself to be a racist. But there is norms and there is preconditioning of society that has made me other, that had made me, believe it or not, the US Constitution says I'm 3/5 a human being. to this day. That's not, brothers and sisters, just a police problem. We have a problem, like I said earlier, with our families and with our neighbors and with our friends and with our colleagues that really we have to deal with. Transnationally, within our countries and within our within our own neighborhoods. So my focus is, how do I change the mind of that woman who called the police that it's okay for actually for a white woman and a black man to be in a car and driving slowly? That is the hardest conversation that we have to have, and that has to start in our union halls.
So, I mean, thanks for that, Tefere, because and I can see already in the chat bar, very shared concerns about, that we should be outraged at the story that you just told to us. It is outrageous, but the only way we address that, we fix that, is by what we do as trade unionists in our branches, in our associations, in our workplaces, that we have to begin to have those conversations, and we need to be having hard conversations, and sometimes they may be harsh conversations, but they need to take place, and we shouldn't shy away from them. I wonder, Chidi, if you have any observations on either what Tefere has just said, or how that bigger question of how we can take this this opportunity, if you will, this opportunity, this moment in time, where governments are thinking beyond the coronavirus crisis and thinking about how they can secure economic recovery. On whose backs is that economic recovery going to be secured? How do we ensure that we can have an economic recovery which addresses the issues of injustice which we've spoken about this afternoon?
Thank you. I just trying to marshal my thoughts on this. I think certainly one of the things that we need to guard against is waiting for things to happen and then reacting to them. So we have to be out there in front, setting our agenda right now, because as we know, the other sides are already marshalling their forces, wanting to continue not only business as usual, but to seize the advantage they have and deepen it. So if we're waiting to see what comes out after the perhaps health emergency of the current pandemic that we're in, and the measures that governments have put in place temporarily to dampen the economic shocks, then we're already losing the battle. I'd say we have to use every tool at our disposal in this, and we are a big movement, a strong movement. We're the largest movement actually of people in the world, so we ought to be able to use that as a force of change. But in that, we have to be organized, we have to be strategic, we really have to look at these tools that we have at our disposal. Of course, there's education, there's awareness raising, so that broader educational aspect of it, denouncing injustices as and when they occur, as Carmen said. But beyond that, how do we use the media, whether it's social media, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's our own media, again, to put forward our message and being very clear about what that message is, and how do we bring people to rally around that message. How do we use the courts, for example, to challenge what politicians are doing all over the world, trampling all over, people's human rights, trampling over our trade union rights? How do we use those mechanisms as well to propel change and to push back? I think one of the reasons, of course, there are many, but one of the reasons why the far right has been so successful is that they have taken over our institutions. They really have, whether it's our educational institutions, our court, our justice institutions, of course, our political institutions. So how do we also organize to take back those institutions? That's something that we need to think about, strategize for, plan for, and do, you know, because it won't happen on its own. I think I'll just close on, you know, borrowing the words from my 23-year-old nephew who was writing a spoken word piece of poetry and saying that nothing will change until we change the system. So if a 23-year-old can be that determined, I think, you know, the rest of us all can have that determination to change the system as well.
Well, there's certainly hope to be gained from our young people because that's the insight that we all need and the determination that we all need to carry forward. I want to bring Priya in, and I noticed, I mean, Chidi, you made some really important points there for me about, you know, the institutions that have, if you will, been hijacked, have been taken over by those forces of racism and far-right ideology, and how we need to reclaim those institutions. That is so crucially important, whether that's about, you know, our education systems, whether that's about our media, whether that is about our social media. And of course, you know, we're having this session today and we're benefiting from, you know, the impact of technology. And I do wonder, Priya, whether you have any thoughts about, again, about how we can regroup and take this moment to articulate a vision for justice, which we can secure. How do we go about securing that when quite often the institutions that Chidi referred to are being turned against us and against our interests? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, the education system in India is diverse because in the Indian academic culture, there is a unity in diversity. In the education system, there is a variety in history, language, and culture. India is a very diverse country on many levels. It is a country of many languages, culture, religion, and regions. In addition, issues of inequality based on gender, caste, social class, and ability have been identified as central concerns of education in India.
Thank you very much for that, Priya. Now, colleagues, we've just about reached the end of our time, and I know that looking at the chat, there's a lot more that we could have discussed this afternoon. There's a lot more that colleagues want to be discussing, and I'm really pleased about that. There is an appetite not just for this discussion, but for this engagement and for this collaboration across our various countries, India, the United States, Brazil, and of course the UK and beyond, no doubt. But if I can say thank you to Priya, to Tefere, to Chidi, to Carmen for your contributions. I know that this session is due to finish at 5, and I don't want to lose people by running over, so I am going to be quite disciplined, harsh even, in that respect. But I do want to thank all of our contributors this afternoon who have brought such insight and you know, such a reminder of the power of our unions. You know, we are a great force for change, and we've got to have the determination to bring about that change. Our unions have a proud history in the fight against racism and fascism, but as we've heard this afternoon, it's clear that that fight is far from over. And we shouldn't forget either that, as well as hatred of racial minorities, if you will, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of hatred are also prevailing features on far-right agendas. But it's not just language and narrative. It's the differences in income, which we've heard about today, differences in income and wealth, differences in life chances and life expectancy, differences in educational outcomes and the chances of getting good and secure employment. These are the issues that clearly we need to be tackling as a movement. But with our actions, the monuments to slavery and imperialism are falling as a renewed movement for social change and racial justice has once again awoken. And as our trade unions, both nationally and internationally, are and must be part of that movement for change, we need to act for racial justice on our streets, in our workplaces, and in our communities. Far-right networks, we know, colleagues, are being reinvigorated by international finance and by the opportunities for global online organising. So we too must renew our commitment to internationalism and commit to action locally, nationally, and globally. And as our governments seek to roll back on workers' rights, the right to work, the right to collective bargaining, the right to be treated with dignity at work, and the right of our trade unions to exist, we must organise and we must respond. Racism, nationalism, xenophobia, we must work together, coalition building between trade unions, social movements, civil society organisations, to ensure that this pivotal moment of national and international condemnation following the murder of George Floyd becomes an enduring movement for real and lasting political, economic, industrial, and social change. Unions and our allies need to come together in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in order to discuss the implications of the current crisis and to find fresh ways to strengthen global worker solidarity. The trade union movement is on the front lines, colleagues, of efforts to address the impacts not only of COVID-19, but also of structural racism, inequality at the national and international level. And as we navigate this crisis, we have the opportunity to forge a vibrant internationalism that can reshape global policy and politics, to reshape and rebuild for an economy and for a politics that ends injustice. So we've demonstrated today that we have the opportunity and the ability to focus our organising regionally, nationally and internationally, building our networks regionally and nationally, and using digital tools to connect with each other. And we have the invitation to be part of the movement to defeat structural and institutional racism, and we must take up that invitation. So thank you again to all of our speakers for their brilliant contributions this afternoon. You've given us all a huge amount to think about, but also a huge amount to act on. We need to act on the need for honesty in our deliberations, the need to be annoying in our discussions, the need for us to confront and to call out racial injustice, the need to ensure that all in our movement understand the impact of racism on all workers, the need to end poverty and the attack on our democracy, the need to mobilise to challenge those who are the architects of racism, injustice and hatred in all its forms, the need to secure a progressive agenda that protects the rights of migrant workers and Black workers after this pandemic, and of course the need to build and to strengthen our alliances. So thank you, colleagues, for highlighting those issues with us today. And can I thank the TUC and also BSL interpreters for pulling together this session today and also for making it happen. And thank you all for your participation today.
Stop Bolsonaro.
Don't forget about the workshop session that we have on Saturday, where some more examples of good workplace practice in these challenging times will be showcased. And let's leave this session today renewed, ready, and determined to organise. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, interpreters.